evening, everyone. Well, that's a little loud. I'm Nadine Collins. I'm the Advancement Officer at St. Jerome's University. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is the fourth lecture in the 2011-2012 lecture series in Catholic Experience. And this lecture series is one of the 5 programs run through the Center for Responsible Citizenship here at St. Jerome's University. Through this series, we strive to provide free public lectures on a variety of topics of interest to all different faiths relevant to faith in today's world. We're able to provide these lectures thanks to the generosity of our donors. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the Loretto Sisters in honor of their founding superior, Teresa Dease. Thanks to their commitment, we're delighted to bring you Dr. Kathleen Maas Weigert. She's speaking tonight on the call to nonviolence in a violent world. What does the Catholic social tradition offer? Kathleen is the Carolyn Farrell BVM Professor in Women in Leadership and Assistant to the Provost for Social Justice Initiatives at Loyola University College. Prior to joining Loyola, she was the Executive Director of the Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching, and Service at Georgetown University. This center was created in January 2001 when Dr. Maas Weigert joined the university as the first director and served as a research professor in both the Department of Sociology and the program on Justice and Peace. At Loyola, Dr. Maas Weigert, who reports to the Provost, will be working with colleagues who determine the next stage of social justice work for the university. So clearly we have someone well-versed in what she's talking about this evening. After receiving her BA and MA in International Relations from the University of Minnesota, she obtained a Ph.D. in Sociology from the University of Notre Dame. She has lectured, facilitated workshops, taught and published on such topics as experiential and community-based learning, nonviolence, the Catholic social tradition, and education and peace and justice and peace. She is the co-designer of Notre Dame's Concentration in Peace Studies, as well as the designer of Notre Dame's Concentration in Catholic Social Tradition. She is the co-designer of Social Justice Analysis Concentration in the Sociology major at Georgetown, and she is the co-editor of America's Working Poor and an author of The Search for the Common Ground, What Unites and Divides Catholic Americans. That won the 1998 Award for Excellence in Research. She is co-editor of Teaching for Justice, Concepts and Models for Service Learning and Peace Studies, and Living the Catholic Social Tradition, Cases and Commentary. Dr. Maas Weigert is a co-recipient of the University of Notre Dame's 1991 Grenville Clark Award, which is given for voluntary activities advancing the cause of peace and human rights. In 1997, the National Peace Studies Association gave her its award in recognition of her steadfast commitment to the development of peace studies. She was one of the 10 finalists selected for the National Campus Compact's 1999 Thomas Ehrlich Faculty Award for Service Learning. And in the spring of 2000, she received the University of Notre Dame's Reinhold Niebuhr Award, which is given to one whose life and writings promote or exemplify the area of social justice in modern life. She is currently researching social justice initiatives in the work of Jane Addams and is working on a proposal for a book on social justice and social science perspectives. She serves on the board of the Jesuit Social Research Institute at Loyola University, New Orleans, and Community Links International, and on the National Coordinating Committee for the Department of Education's Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement Initiatives. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Maas Weigert.
Good evening. Let me begin by thanking Jim Frank from SJU, Sister Yvonne, who actually heard me speak last night and decided she should go home. I don't know if that's a warning to you or not, but she headed back to Toronto. And Nadine Collins and Heather Lagonia for all the work that makes this kind of an event possible. It's a delight to come up north. Second, what I hope to do in my remarks is lift up some of the resources and some of the challenges presented in and by the Catholic social tradition for all of us who are striving to live lives of nonviolence. Third, because I am a hopeless Trinitarian, I will frame my remarks in three categories. First, some ways of understanding the terms violence and nonviolence. Second, some resources from our sacred scriptures and from church documents. And finally, what this might mean for us in going forward. But I want to preface my remarks with a bit of personal background so you have a better sense of where I am coming from. I am obviously a white woman who was formally educated with advanced degrees and a professional in terms of occupation and income. But other descriptors might not be so visible, and yet they are important for you to know. I come from a very Catholic middle-class family and neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota, one of the great states that borders Canada. I'm a product of Catholic elementary and secondary education, plus 2 years in the convent of the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, with whom I continue as an associate. I do have, as Nadine mentioned, a BA and MA in IR from the University of Minnesota, where I was active in the Minnesota Student Association and in the Newman Club, where I met my husband, who is a former Jesuit. No, I did not lure him out of the Society of Jesus. I have to set the record straight early on. He came to me after he left. For as long as I can remember, I have been interested in global issues. It might have been as early as 4th grade when I helped collect money for, excuse the language, but this is what we said, the pagan babies in far-off countries. But it wasn't until the 1980s when I became interested in the field of justice and peace studies. My engagement with it has impacted and continues to impact my life, professionally and personally. That composite of experiences has shaped my deep passion for justice and peace, and it is out of that mix that I speak to you tonight about the call to nonviolence. So, what might we mean by the terms violence and nonviolence? Violence is a term that can strike fear into our hearts. For some, the idea of nature and severe weather come to mind. The swath of destruction, for example, left in the path of tornadoes or hurricanes, and the helplessness we feel. We talk about violent storms. Many of us first think about direct personal violence, such as the horrors of domestic violence or gang warfare. In a world of uprisings, others of us think as well about wars and revolutions, and the death not only of combatants, but of civilians as well. The stark reality of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, where some 800,000 to 1 million people died in 100 days, is seared into our minds and hearts. All of these images make us pause, perhaps feeling helpless as we wonder how on earth such violence, especially that caused by humans, can continue and what we might do to mitigate its effects and, even more importantly, contribute to its prevention. Let me begin with one example that relates to direct violence in the global arena. It goes by the name of R2P, that is, responsibility to protect. R2P refers to a new national security and human rights norm, which was first put forth at the United Nations 2005 World Summit. At that summit, leaders committed to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansings, and crimes against humanity. This norm begins with the idea that the state has the primary responsibility to use appropriate means to prevent those kinds of problems. But it turns out they must use diplomatic, humanitarian, other peaceful means first in order to do that. Perhaps most important, though, should a state fail to protect its own citizens, or in fact perpetrate these measures, crimes against their own citizens, then the international community must be prepared to take stronger measures, including the collective use of force through the UN Security Council. The situation in Syria is simply the most recent, painful example of the challenges the international community faces in this arena. And devastating and complicated as direct violence is, there's another kind of violence that the field of justice and peace studies lifts up. It goes by the name of structural violence. And here, rather than being harm intentionally caused by individuals in a direct personal way, this is a violence that is indeed harm to others, but one that refers to preventable harm or damage to persons where there is no actor committing the violence or where it is not practical to search for the actors. Such violence emerges from the unequal distribution of power and resources, or in other words, is said to be built into the structures. It was the Norwegian sociologist Professor Johan Galtung who introduced this term in a 1969 essay. But he pinpointed the actual genesis of the term to experiences he had had decades earlier in what was then called Southern Rhodesia, today Zimbabwe. He wrote that structures are, and I quote, "the settings within which individuals may do enormous amounts of harm to other human beings without ever intending to do so, just performing their regular duties as a job defined in a structure." Structural violence then was seen as unintended harm done to human beings as a process, working slowly in the way misery in general and hunger in particular erode and finally kill human beings. End of quotation. I describe structural violence in some detail for several reasons. First, the term with which some of you may already be familiar is a fairly recent one in social science. It is a new tool, if you will, for both research and policy. Second, it can help all of us focus on ways in which violence permeates so much of our world. It allows for a different way we might confront that violence. And third, because it is a term that is finding a place in the Catholic world where it is referred to as structures of sin or social sin. More on that in the second part of my talk. Let me offer then some data on one example of structural violence, the one Galtung referred to, namely hunger. Many of you know that among the 8 Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs as we call them, established by the United Nations in the year 2000, the first goal is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. There is good news. According to a World Bank report, for the first time, the proportion of people living in extreme poverty on less than $1.25 a day fell in every developing region from 2005 to 2008. And between 1981, when the World Bank started keeping these statistics, and 2008, poverty fell in 1/4 of the developing world's population. It had been up to half. Although 1 in 4 children under the age of 5 is underweight in the developing world, that is down from almost 1 in 3. According to the United Nations 2011 report on the MDGs, I quote, "Despite significant setbacks after the 2008-2009 economic downturn, exacerbated by the food and energy crisis, the world is still on track to reach the poverty reduction target. By 2015, it is now expected that the global poverty rate will fall below 15%, well under the 23% target." End of quotation. Let me tell you one particular bit of good news on that front. It is from Rwanda, the site of that horrific genocide. Just last month, Rwanda released data that show enormous improvement in the living standards of its citizens over the past 5 years, due to an average annual growth of real GDP of 8.4%, sparked largely by higher productivity in the agricultural and industrial sectors. That growth has benefited its poor citizens. One way is through the program of 1 cow per family, which provides families with milk for consumption, and what is left over is sold for profit, improving nutrition and income at the household level. Taken together, these data point to the serious example of structural violence that is hunger, but also to how it can be addressed in very real ways. Now, what I have just talked about is obviously violence, both direct or personal, and indirect or structural. And these are important terms for all of us to grapple with. But they provide a somewhat limited sense of nonviolence. We could just say nonviolence is the opposite of violence. But that does not get us very deep into the term. And the term is complicated. For starters, it's a negative, nonviolence. It brings to mind for many the idea of pacifism, spelled P-A-C-I-F-I-S-M, which in turn sounds like passivism, P-A-S-S-I-V-I-S-M. But for many religious and secular people, it is not a negative term. It is a very positive term. How so? Let me offer an idea from Gene Sharp, the senior scholar at the Albert Einstein Institution in the United States, which he founded in 1983. Many of you may know his name because of the influence of his work most recently on the Arab Spring. Almost 40 years ago, Sharp wrote what is considered by many to be the Bible of nonviolence, his 3-volume work entitled The Politics of Nonviolent Action. The title hints at one of his ideas that I think is fruitful for all of us to consider. Periodically use nonviolence as an adjective, not a noun. Thus, Sharp talks about nonviolent action or nonviolent struggle. The use of an adjective rather than a noun is more in keeping with the idea that we are about action. We are about struggle for positive change, struggle that will encounter obstacles that must be overcome, all the while rejecting violent means to do so. It's because he wants to emphasize that conflict can be approached and resolved in different ways, and that while many people, perhaps most, feel that conflict can be resolved ultimately only through violent means, Sharp has spent his life researching, writing, developing, and communicating the idea that conflict can indeed be resolved through nonviolent means. I'm getting a cold, excuse me. He argues, and I quote, "Although it has been known by a variety of names, its basis has always been the same. The belief that the exercise of power depends on the consent of the ruled, who, by withdrawing that consent, can control and even destroy the power of their opponent." In other words, nonviolent action is a technique used to control, combat, and destroy the opponent's power by nonviolent means of wielding power. End of quotation. This has implications from the interpersonal to the international levels, but I hasten to add that for Gene Sharp, that commitment to nonviolence is a pragmatic one. He believes that nonviolent action can result in achieving one's aims. It works, in other words, with less harm to others than if violent means had been used. But for others, such as Martin Luther King Jr., the commitment is a principled one. That is, it is not contingent on whether it works or not, although King believed and I think demonstrated that it would. It is based on a belief that it is the better way, the more humane way, the more moral way. Because as King wrote, and I quote, "We adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself." End of quotation. Another contribution to thinking about nonviolence comes from those who focus on the term peace. Here again I refer to the field of justice and peace studies. There is a distinction, attributed once more to the genius Professor Galtung, between negative and positive peace. In the former, the idea is the absence of war, the absence of violence. In the latter, the idea is more than the absence of violence. It is the presence of justice. An important footnote, peace then is the opposite of violence, not of conflict. We will always have conflict. The issue is how do we resolve it. Here it is where I want now to turn to the resources that the Catholic social tradition offers us as we try to understand what we might do to lessen the violence in our world, and even more, to build the structures and processes for positive peace. I preface my remarks in this section with 2 comments. First, I prefer to use the label Catholic social tradition as the most inclusive of the various terms, the other common 2 being Catholic social teachings and Catholic social thought. For me, Catholic social tradition encompasses the other 2 and goes beyond them to include the lives of ordinary and extraordinary people who have tried to live out their faith in the public arena. Lives that contribute to making real the commitment to nonviolence in our own times. 2 of my favorite are Dorothy Day and Cesar Chavez. And the word tradition also suggests that it is alive, meaning it can grow, and that means it can change. As the word suggests then, there is always the possibility of growth for individuals and the tradition itself. Second, there is always the danger when referring to documents that one might proof text, that is, find the parts that one likes, using them without the full context. It is a danger. I hope I don't contribute to that as much as I contribute to some creative thinking about the richness that comes from these documents. Christians, however, who want to deepen their understanding of and commitment to a more nonviolent life must begin, it seems to me, with the life of Jesus Christ. And that is a Jewish life, embedded in the history and the stories of the Old Testament, or what we call the Hebrew Scriptures. Let me make just one comment about the Old Testament for my purposes tonight. The idea of shalom, the Hebrew word for peace, is more than the absence of armed conflict or violence, or what I called a moment ago negative peace. As Jesuit John Donahue says, peace suggests wholeness, completeness, or health. And he points out that one legacy of the Old Testament, I quote him here, that peace, the condition which prevails in a healthy society, can never exist apart from the quest for justice. End of quotation. So, negative and positive peace, again in the terminology I used above, are intertwined in our sacred text. The idea of peace is central to the life and message of Jesus Christ. I want to draw on just 3 instances that continue to challenge and inspire me when thinking about the call to nonviolence. The first has to do with times to pray. The Gospel of Luke, for example, says, "But he would withdraw to deserted places and pray." And again he says, "Now during those days he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God." For those of us trying to follow in his footsteps, we need the reminder to take time, to withdraw, to deepen our relationship with God. The second instance comes from the wonderful Beatitudes, where we find, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." To which I say, amen. And finally, the third comes from the last words of Jesus as he lay dying on the cross. Here we find the essential gift in a life of nonviolence, the gift of forgiveness and reconciliation. Jesus prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The challenge his nonviolent life presents to us is at the heart of our call to follow in his footsteps and to lead nonviolent lives as well. And the church continues to build on that life and that message. In raising the importance of being peace in this world, the church, and I mean it here in the fullest understanding, reads the signs of the times and urges the rejection of violent means to resolve conflict or advance one's interests, and supports instead the adoption and development of nonviolent means. Let me turn then to the documentary history in this tradition to spell that out a bit. As many of you know, historians point to Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, issued in 1891, as the beginning of the modern tradition. I want to discuss ideas from just 3 documents that I find especially helpful when considering an expansive call to nonviolence. John the 23rd's Pacem in Terris, Paul VI's Evangelii Nunciandi, and John Paul II's Solicitudo Rei Socialis. Just a reminder, the encyclicals were written using man to mean everyone, and so most of the quotations I will use incorporate that unfortunate language from my point of view. Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth in the English translation. It was issued on Holy Thursday in 1963 during the historic Second Vatican Council and shortly before the Pontiff's death. It is a rich letter, one we all can fruitfully return to again and again. I want to highlight 3 ideas that help frame our call to nonviolence from that document: human rights and duties, the idea of the universal common good, and the concern about war. Pope John opens his section on rights with this statement, and I quote, "Beginning our discussion of the rights of man, we see that every man has the right to life, to bodily integrity, and to the means which are necessary and suitable for the proper development of life. These are primarily food, clothing, shelter, rest, medical care, and finally, the necessary social services. End of quotation. Those of you who are fans, as I am, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the document approved by the United Nations General Assembly December 10, 1948, will sense that there is a similarity between that statement and the UDHR, especially Article 25, and there is. In fact, later in his encyclical, the Pontiff refers to the Declaration in laudatory terms, calling its approval an act of the highest importance. It is necessary to note that with every right, there is a correlative duty. So the Pope states, and I quote, "For example, the right of every man to life is correlative with the duty to preserve it. His right to a decent manner of living with the duty of living it becomingly." End of quotation. The Pontiff lays out ideas on the rights and duties beyond those of individuals, looking at relationships between individuals and the public authorities within a single state, relations between nations, and finally, the relationships of individuals and of political communities with the world community. And it is in building this sequence that the Pope expands the crucial idea of the common good to include the universal common good. John writes, and I quote, "The unity of the human family has always existed because its members were human beings, all equal by virtue of their natural dignity. Hence, there will always exist the objective need to promote, in sufficient measure, the universal common good, that is, the common good of the entire human family." End of quotation. And that focus on the universal common good brings to the fore the issue of war. Reading the signs of the times, John comments that people are becoming more and more convinced that disputes which arise between states should not be resolved by recourse to arms, but rather to negotiation. He observes, and I quote, "It is hardly possible to imagine that in the atomic era, war could be used as an instrument of justice." End of quotation. Here again, then, we find negative and positive peace integrally related to each other. Let me focus now on ideas in the second document, Paul VI Evangelii Nuntiandi, or in the English translation, on the evangelization of the modern world. But here, just to let you know I don't do everything in threes, I want to refer to just two ideas that add to our discussion of the call to nonviolence. The first brings into focus the witness each of us believers must give. Pope Paul proclaims the one thing in particular provides primary importance in evangelizing is the witness of life. He writes, and I quote, "Above all, the gospel must be proclaimed by witness, and the very witness of life has to be proclaimed by the word of life. There is no true evangelization if the name, the teaching, the life, the promises, the kingdom, and the mystery of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, are not proclaimed." End of quotation. The second citation is a clear denunciation of the use of violence in war, as war is the example, in proclaiming the gospel. Again, I quote, "The church cannot accept violence, especially the form of arms, which is uncontrollable once it is let loose, an indiscriminate death, as the path to liberation, because she knows that violence always provokes violence and irresistibly engenders new forms of oppression and enslavement, which are often harder to bear than those from which they claim to bring freedom. We must say and reaffirm that violence is not in accord with the gospel, that it is not Christian, and that sudden or violent changes of structures would be deceitful, ineffective of themselves, and certainly not in conformity with the dignity of people." End of quotation. So if we are to be true to the requirement to evangelize, then the witness of our life and our collective lives, our words and our deeds, must speak the message of nonviolence. I turn then to the final document, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, or in the English translation, On Social Concern. This encyclical was written for the 20th anniversary of Paul VI Populorum Progressio and focused, as did that earlier document, on development. But there are two hallmarks of this encyclical that inform my thinking about the general call to nonviolence. The first is John Paul's presentation on the idea of structures of sin. Here is what he says, Quote, "The sum total of negative factors working against a true awareness of the universal common good and the need to further it gives the impression of creating in persons and institutions an obstacle which is difficult to overcome. These structures are rooted in personal sin and thus always linked to the concrete acts of individuals who introduce these structures, consolidate them, and make them difficult to remove. And thus they grow stronger, spread, and become the source of others' sins, and so influence people's behavior. For the pontiff, it is a question of a moral evil, the sin and the sins they produce, which lead to the structures of sin. And these structures are radically opposed to peace and development." End of a long quotation. So we see here again the similarity between the ideas found in the field of justice and peace studies and the ideas found in our contemporary Catholic social tradition. In my growing up years, infused with the Baltimore Catechism, no one talked to me about structures of sin. But as you know, I have a background in sociology and justice and peace studies. Those have led me to a realization of the reality of structures and their importance in influencing the opportunities we have and don't have, and the decisions we make and don't make. I might be stronger than the pontiff in emphasizing the point that structures have an independent reality, one that shapes people's opportunities and decisions. But the tradition is emphatic about the sinful responses each of us makes in our daily lives. So, while not trying to downplay the importance of individual responsibility, the idea of structures of sin ties back well to the earlier concept I introduced, namely structural violence, and reminds me that looking for individual actors in such structures isn't either possible or fruitful. But at the same time, I have to keep looking for ways to help make those structures more humane and more just. The balance is acknowledging our own complicity, but always looking for nonviolent ways to change those structures to make them more humane. And that work of changing structures leads to the second concept that I find so invigorating when thinking about the call to nonviolence, namely John Paul's comprehensive view of solidarity. The concept of structures of sin in itself bespeaks interdependence, and that is a key for the pontiff. We are all members of the family of God. We are interdependent. The virtue at the heart of this interdependence is solidarity, by which the pontiff means, and I quote, "a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, that is to say, to the good of all and each individual, because we all are really responsible for all." So the structures of sin are only conquered, presupposing the help of divine grace, by a diametrically opposed attitude, a commitment to the good of one's neighbor with the readiness in the gospel sense to lose oneself for the sake of the other, instead of exploiting him, and to serve him instead of oppressing him for one's own advantage. End of quotation. And here we again find the link between seeking the good of the other and the necessity for a commitment to nonviolence or peace. And I quote him once more. Every individual is called upon to play his or her part, that's actually in the document, his or her part, in this peaceful campaign, a campaign to be conducted by peaceful means in order to secure development in peace, in order to safeguard nature itself and the world about us. End of quotation. So, taking all of this together, what do we do next in going forward? There are both challenges and inspiration in the resources of the Catholic social tradition for those of us who want to live out a commitment to a nonviolent life. For someone like me, I remind you of some of the points I made at the beginning of my comments describing myself. It's fairly easy to talk about nonviolent action. I don't live in Syria or Congo or Afghanistan. I don't hear gunshots during the day or night. I don't live in fear of bombs going off nearby. I don't even live in a bad neighborhood in the city of Chicago. I live in a condo that has 24-hour security, which is located in a very safe neighborhood. I am a white woman, so I get the benefits of that identity when women and men of color do not have that privilege. So my experience of violent action comes largely through the media, through articles and books, through conversations with perpetrators and victims of violence, and through some international travel I have done to Kenya and El Salvador, for example, where I've had the opportunity to listen to others whose lives were saturated with violence. There is, for example, Guadalupe in El Salvador, whose husband was tortured and murdered in the Civil War, and who fearlessly continues to this day to speak out for and to honor those who were killed. I carry her story and those of others I have heard with me, and try to let them seep into my being when I talk perhaps a bit too facilely about trying to lead a life of nonviolence. Let that be a segue then to my final 3 ideas that I take from this rich Catholic social tradition, ideas that both challenge and inspire. First, we have to think about our own situation and its relationship to violence. For some, direct violence is a part of their daily lives. For others, it is not. For some, structural violence of a force like hunger stalks them every day. For others, it does not. For those of us who have the advantage of not experiencing violence in our daily lives, our call is to make sure we do not ignore our brothers and sisters not so advantaged. Being with others who have experienced violence in ways that we never have and perhaps never will is an essential step in our ongoing journey. Whether in our local or global community, each of us can make sure that we somehow journey with those whose lives are enmeshed in violence. Second, there is work to be done collectively. Action is called for. The privileges of not being subject to violence must call forth creative work to rid the world of the all too prevalent tools, processes, and structures of violence that hinder the full development of the family of God. The variety of ways in which we can join the struggle are almost limitless. Perhaps our parishes have programs, or we could start them, like the one in my archdiocese, which is working with the nonprofit Pace Bene to integrate gospel violence into parish life. We can find organizations in our local communities devoted to protecting those harmed by violence and or helping to foster reconciliation. Pause for water. Sorry. Thank you, Nadine. One such program with roots in Native peoples in North America and New Zealand is the Victor Offender Reconciliation Program that started originally here in Ontario and in Indiana in the 70s and has thankfully spread around the globe. Or perhaps we want to participate in more national or global efforts to promote nonviolent action. We can write our political representatives to support some kind of legislation, or join others to write letters to and on behalf of prisoners of conscience through Amnesty International. We can donate money to organizations like Doctors Without Borders or Bread for the World. We can support such efforts as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, a component of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which, and I quote, hopes to guide and inspire Aboriginal peoples and Canadians in the process of reconciliation and renewed relationships that are based on mutual understanding and respect. End of quotation. Third, I turn finally and fundamentally to why we must respond to the call of nonviolence and help in the building of peace. I hope you will indulge this non-Canadian citizen for referring to a document written by what was called the National Conference of Catholic Bishops in the United States. In the conclusion of their profound and profoundly important pastoral letter of 1983, entitled "The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response," the bishop stated this, and I quote, "Peacemaking is not an optional commitment. It is a requirement of our faith. We are called to be peacemakers not by some movement of the moment, but by our Lord Jesus. The content and context of our peacemaking is set not by some political agenda or ideological program, but by the teaching of His church." End of quotation. If we are to respond to that requirement as creatively as we can, there is no denying that we must turn again and again to prayer, both individual and collective, as we strive to undo the chains of greed and domination that wrap around our hearts, leaving us prone to use violent means, either of spirit or body, to achieve our ends. So, relying on the wisdom from the Old Testament, rooted in the life of Jesus Christ as told in the New Testament, emboldened by the documentary history of the Catholic social tradition with its emphasis on human rights and duties, the rejection of war, the reality of the structures of sin, the universal common good, the wonderful virtue of solidarity, and the inspiration of the lives of ordinary and extraordinary people, we must work together to renew our minds and hearts to respond ever more faithfully to the call of nonviolence in this hurting, suffering, and yet also God-infused and God-graced world of ours. Let us continue in that noble work together. Thank you.